They all had something in common that no one else will ever have in common with them. A political leader and great lawgiver. A shepherd who was the youngest of many brothers. A renowned king who had over 1,000 wives. A political prisoner. A caretaker of trees. The husband of a prostitute. What did they all have in common? What Moses, David, Solomon, Jeremiah, Amos and Hosea had in common is that they all wrote parts of the Hebrew Scriptures, what is commonly called the Old Testament. It took many people. There were probably at least 30 primary authors. It took a long time, in fact, over 1,000 years, from at least 1400 to 400 BC. This collection of writings is revered by Jews and Christians even to this day. A Jewish Simchat Torah festival. A people in almost frenzied delight. They celebrate a book. They do this every year upon the completion of the annual cycle of Sabbath Torah readings in the synagogue. Today we introduce the Old Testament, and frankly, we can only scratch the surface. We can give you some basic facts related to this book, but those to whom it was originally given would perhaps remind us that we're dealing with something that is, for them, far more than just a book.
I read it as Jews have loved it. For example, did you know this? I could tell you what is the middle word in the Torah. I can tell you what's the middle letter in the Torah, because over the generations, Jewish scholars have read the Torah not as a novel to see how it ends. They've read it as a love letter. Why did he use this word and not that word? Why is there a space here? Why a comma instead of a period? The way you read a love letter, now what did she mean by this word? We have seen it as not just a book, not just stories, not even a law code. We have seen it as a love letter from God.
These Hebrew Scriptures decisively shaped the living memory and identity of a unique people. They are revered as writings from antiquity, yet at the same time treasured, even today, as an ever-living word. A very old Jewish tradition has it that the Torah, or first 5 books of the Bible, existed in heaven before God gave them to Moses, even before the world was created. The legendary Rabbi Akiba in the 2nd century actually called the Torah the precious instrument by which the world was created. And Judah Halevi taught that God created the world for the purpose of revealing the Torah. The scrolls used in Jewish worship are a collection of writings gathered over many centuries by the Jewish people. These Hebrew Scriptures are also commonly called the Old Testament. Testament here refers to a covenant or agreement, or a series of agreements between God and the people of Israel. The Jews divide their scriptures, consisting of 24 books, into 3 sections: the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings. The Law is also called the Torah, or the 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch, which means 5 rolls. The Law consists of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These 5 books are the most important ones to the Jews. The other books are revered and important too, but the Torah is central. These books cover the foundational events in both human and Jewish history. Genesis begins at the very beginning, the creation of the world, and the first 11 chapters are about God's dealing with humanity. Then in chapter 12, the focus shifts to an individual named Abraham and his family. He lived about 4,000 years ago and came from the city of Ur, located in what is today Iraq. Abraham, at God's command, left his home and went out in faith to a different land to which he was called as the father of a promised nation. We meet his son Isaac and grandson Jacob. Genesis ends with Joseph and the people of Israel sojourning in Egypt to escape famine. In Exodus we learn how the people were enslaved in Egypt and about the miraculous deliverance God provided. Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy give us details of the formation of the Jewish people after Egypt and the laws, worship, and teachings around which the delivered people were organized under Moses. The next section of the Hebrew Scriptures is called the Prophets. The Prophets are in 2 sections. The former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, give us the history of the Jewish people from entry into the Promised Land, the time Israel was ruled by judges, the era of their kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, and then the eventual division into 2 kingdoms, north and south, and the eventual fall of both kingdoms to invading forces after the people had neglected the law of God. The latter prophets give us more history and teaching of how God is dealing with his people. These are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the Book of the 12. The 12 are also sometimes called the minor prophets, not because they're unimportant, but because they are shorter in length. The third part of the Hebrew Scriptures is known as the Writings, a varied section that includes the Psalms, the hymn book of Israel, and the wisdom literature of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. The other books are the Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Now, while this totals 24 books, these correspond exactly to the 39 Old Testament books as found in Christian Bibles. The difference is due to dividing Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, and Ezra, Nehemiah into 2 sections each, and counting each of the 12 or minor prophets as separate books. It will help us to grasp what the Hebrew Scriptures are all about if we think of them as revolving around some key concepts, which for simplicity we'll summarize with words beginning with the letter P. They have to do with providence. The Hebrew Scriptures manifest a constant awareness that the God who created all is involved with his creation and active in the history of humanity. And the Bible's view of what history is differs markedly from the typical views that prevailed. In Bible times, it was common to think of the world as an endless cycle tied to nature and the seasons, or a wheel of unending recurrences, as the Greeks put it, whereas the Bible's view is progressive or linear, with history having a purpose and the world moving forward to a goal. A people. The people who descended from the great patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. a people specially chosen and set apart by God for unique service in, to, and for the world. A place. The land of Israel promised to this people by God if they would faithfully follow him. A promise. This people and God were united by a covenant or agreement that God would be with them, guide them, bless them, if they would follow his ways. Prophecy in two senses of the word. First, prophecy as warnings against injustice, idolatry, and social evil. Second, prophecy as predictions about the future, including the assurance that a Messiah would come to save and deliver his people. The Hebrew Scriptures, then, are about God relating to human beings, his people, our world, and history. It deals with places that even now, thousands of years later, you can still almost hear the echoes of the historical events. Places like the land which Abraham left to follow God, or the Negev where Abraham settled after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, or Egypt where Israel was held in captivity, or the Jordan River that they crossed to enter the Promised Land, or Jericho, the walled city conquered by the Israelites, or Absalom's pillar near Jerusalem, erected to perpetuate the memory of David's tragic son. Thus, the Hebrew Scriptures are replete with stories about specific people and places. Let's look at just one in a little more detail. In the latter part of Genesis, we meet Joseph. He was the youngest of 11 brothers and his father's favorite. He was given a special coat. Their father's partiality and Joseph's attitude made the other brothers angry and jealous. One day, Joseph was sent to check on his brothers who were away tending their father's flocks. The brothers saw their chance. They stripped off his coat and threw him into an empty well. Rather than leave him to die, they decided to sell him to traveling merchants on their way to Egypt. Then they dipped his hated coat in the blood of a goat, so that they could tell their father that he must have been killed by a ferocious animal. When he received their false report, the father's heart was broken. Joseph was taken to Egypt and sold again, this time to Potiphar, one of the Pharaoh's officials. Joseph quickly distinguished himself and was given a high position. But Potiphar's wife had lustful desires for the young man. When he refused her advances, she framed him and had him put in prison. But Joseph had an amazing gift for interpreting dreams, and that was reported to Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. Pharaoh was tormented by troubling dreams, so he sent for the young man. Joseph so impressed the ruler and interpreted his dreams in such detail and so convincingly that he was appointed second in command to Pharaoh, administrator over all of Egypt. The dreams predicted 7 years of famine would follow 7 years of abundant harvests, and so Joseph arranged for massive storage of grain. The prolonged famine came as foretold and affected Joseph's family as well as all Egypt. So Joseph's brothers came to Egypt, seeking to buy food. There, they came face to face with the long-lost brother that they had sold years earlier. Joseph recognized them, but they did not recognize him. So Joseph tested them, even had them imprisoned, so that he could see if their hearts had changed. He later sent them back to fetch the rest of the family and bring them to Egypt, where they could find food. So it came about that this broken, strife-torn family was beautifully reunited. Joseph forgave his brother's violence and gave another of his amazing interpretations, this time not from a dream, but from his life and recognition of God's working behind the scenes, as he explained to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." The story of Joseph and the many others of Abraham's descendants were told over and over, detail by detail, when the people gathered by their fires. And they were recorded on parchment, animal skins, so the account of God's dealing with his appointed people would be preserved and never forgotten. The parchment writings were rolled up into scrolls. Over time, more sections were added. Some were recognized as having special importance and came to be regarded as sacred text or holy scripture. Dr. Bruce Metzger, one of the leading Bible scholars of our century, explains.
So the development of this Old Testament canon was slow, layer by layer, and it looks as though the final capstone of a pronouncement of authoritatively declaring that to be now the complete Old Testament was a pronouncement made at a Jewish council in the town of Jamnia about the year 90 of the Christian era.
The scrolls would eventually wear out and were given an honored burial, but first copies were made, and this raises an important question. Are the versions we have today in any way close to what the Old Testament people themselves had? Quite amazingly, the answer is yes. For the most part, we can be confident that what we have today is nearly identical to the ancient copies. We back that up by drawing your attention to the scribes and the scrolls. The copies of the scrolls of Hebrew Scripture were made by a special group known as scribes. Israelite scribes learned their craft as a kind of holy profession, in family-like guilds, as is attested in the Bible that mentions clans of scribes who inhabit Jabez. The Hebrew word for scribe is sofer. Its root meaning is to count, and scribes indeed were careful counters, making sure every word and letter were accounted for. They worked under very strict conditions and regulations. They went about their work with a seriousness that many would consider almost fanatical today. For example, the Jewish Masoretic scribes, who made handwritten copies of the Bible, worked under rules designed to ensure utmost accuracy. No word or letter could be written from memory. The scribe had to say the word aloud. Before writing the sacred name of God, the scribe had to wipe his pen. A scroll was discarded if spelling errors were found. And perhaps most important, After copying, every single word and every letter were counted to verify accuracy and to be sure that they matched the original. Before beginning his work, a scribe would cleanse himself in a ritual bath, a vivid evidence of the seriousness and sacredness of the task of writing a scroll. He was going to write the names of God and must do so with proper devotion and ritual purity. Then there are the Dead Sea Scrolls. Maybe you've heard the fascinating story of how a Bedouin shepherd boy was out with his flock along the cliffs on the northwest side of the Dead Sea. He thoughtlessly threw a rock into one of the caves. He hears something break. He investigates and finds ancient scrolls stored in large pottery jars. He has accidentally stumbled across the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. Many of these scrolls date back to before the time of Jesus, and they include copies of sections of every Old Testament book except Esther. There is an almost complete copy of the book of Isaiah. Up until the discovery of the scrolls, the oldest available copies of the Hebrew Scriptures dated from around AD 900. The Dead Sea Scrolls provided Hebrew text that was 1,000 years earlier and would show how much the text had been corrupted and changed over 10 centuries. It was a priceless opportunity to see if copies done so much later matched earlier copies that were, of course, that much closer to the originals. So just how well had the scribes done their job over so many generations? Scholars analyzed and discovered that there were some differences. That is not the surprising part. What is surprising is that there were so few differences, and that they were primarily on small matters, such as spelling variations. This is so amazing that it would almost seem impossible. The first ancient Qumran texts led to just 13 minor yet clarifying alterations in the modern Revised Standard Version of the Bible. In our day, there's a danger of misunderstanding the meaning of Old Testament, because we tend to think of something that's old as being obsolete, something to be discarded. It would have perhaps been clearer if the different parts of the Bible were called the First and Second Testaments, or the earlier and later. For the Old Testament is not important just to Jews. Christians look to it as an indispensable part of their scriptures, indeed, the larger part. The two Testaments contain a little over 750,000 words. The Old Testament is a little over 593,000 words, or about 77% of the space of the Protestant Bible. There are over 220 quotes of the Old in the New, and if we count allusions or references, it comes to over 400. 22 of the 27 New Testament books quote or refer to the Old Testament. Thus, while the Hebrew Scriptures relate uniquely to the Jewish people, they are, in a larger sense, a legacy for all peoples.
So the basis and foundation of the New Testament is the Old Testament. And we need both of them in order to have, as it were, both eyes open with respect to God's law.
Take to heart all the words I have solemnly declared to you this day, so that you may command your children to obey carefully all the words of this law. They are not just idle words for you, they are your life.